Hello, everyone. This is State Assembly Member Ron Kim joining you live this evening to have this wonderful panel with Jonathan Bowles and Ila Dvorkin from the Center for an Urban Future to talk about the older American crisis of New York. We have an aging crisis, and they just did a tremendous report with the partnership from ARP called the Keeping Pace with an Aging New York. And I just want to begin this meeting. I chair the Committee on Aging in the State Assembly. This is my second term chairing that committee, doing so much important work protecting older adults throughout the state of New York. And we've been talking about how we've had a crisis for months, for years, and it was so obvious in our face during COVID, in our inability to protect older adults in long-term facilities. We didn't have the workers behind the home care that we desperately needed, and so many people suffered. But there is a tremendous, I think, opportunity now for us to transform how we think about older adults and how we address this problem and how we must come together. Because this isn't about charity. This is about actually making sound economic investments for a sustainable future, as the demographics have dramatically changed over the last many years. And I just want to say, before I introduce our guest today, that we already live in a culturally ageist society where every time you turn on TV, everything is so youth centric. People are turned off by images of older people on pop culture and Instagram, on Facebook. So imagine when there's a study that comes out that keeps saying that there's a crisis and we don't know how to take care of older adults. It's easy in this moment to turn our backs and vilify and demonize older adults, but that is not why we're here. We see this again as an opportunity to reset policies, re-engage the older adults with tremendous institutional knowledge and ability to train up the next generation to fulfill our duties as public servants in the workforce. There's so many opportunities we can be doing better, and that's the ultimate goal that we want to get to. But first, let's get a real sense of what it is we're facing. This report just reveals some shocking numbers about what the crisis looks like. So let's dive into the report that Jonathan and Eli and Charles Shaviro have put together called the Keeping Pace with an Aging New York. So Jonathan, Eli, thank you. I've known the work that you've done, so Center for Urban Future, for so many years. You've touched almost every topic imaginable. You talked about my district, from small businesses to the workforce that impacts the future of the state. But now we're focused on older adults. And how do we get here? And what does the report tell us?
Well, first of all, Assemblyman Kim, thank you for having us on tonight, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. It's so important, and I appreciate you really raising the visibility of this issue. And that's certainly what we try to do in this report that you mentioned. I think you're right. You mentioned that a lot of times older New Yorkers almost seem invisible, and you see so many images on TV, and people often think of New York as the city of 20 somethings. But our data shows that couldn't be further from the truth. New York, according to our research, now has about 1.4 million people that are age 65 and over. That's up significantly from about 1 million just a decade ago. Now, that's not just a record number for New York, people 65 and over. It's more than the entire population of people living in the city of Dallas, which is the country's 9th largest city. So more people 65 and older in New York City today than the entire population of Dallas. Queens alone has more older adults, 403 people that are 65 and older, than the entire population of every other city in New York State. And we got to these numbers because there's been just growth, like you couldn't believe. Over 30% growth in every borough of New York City. There's been growth across the state. And it's happening, this growth in New York City alone, 360,000 new older adults over the past decade. But the rest of the population is actually declining in New York City. The population is down by about 138,000. Statewide, the population under 65 is down by almost 500,000, even while the older adult population went up by about 800,000. So, first of all, our report showed that we're seeing this rapid aging of the population, and this has got to be met with policy responses from state leaders, from city leaders. And I know that you're doing it, but we kind of put this out because we think we need to get the governor, the mayor, lots of other leaders across the city and the state to really be paying attention. And it's not just, there are clearly opportunities, and I'm glad you really framed it that way from the beginning, and I'd love to talk about that in a bit. But there are some real crisis points here, and one of them is that we've seen just an incredible increase in poverty among older New Yorkers across the state. There's actually been a 37% increase of older New Yorkers living in poverty. And today, 1 in 8 New Yorkers over 65 across the state are in poverty. I'll just say a couple last things. In the Bronx alone, 25% of older adults are living below the poverty line, 1 in 4. In Brooklyn, it's 21%. These are alarming numbers. They're also unacceptable. We're going to have to really not just plan for the aging of the population in New York, which we need to, but we're going to have to really figure out strategies to combat this alarming increase in poverty we're seeing among older adults. We're going to have to deal with issues from financial security to housing to social isolation. And I'm sure we'll have time to get into all of that, but that's kind of our report in a nutshell.
Eli, would you like to add anything?
Well, let me just add a couple of thoughts there. And again, thanks so much for having us on, Assemblyman. But one point about poverty, there was good news prior to the pandemic. We've been moving in the right direction as a state, as a city, not just in general with poverty rates declining, but older adult poverty in particular. So even though the older adult population has boomed, we'd seen prior to the pandemic that poverty rates has been coming down steadily for several years. So what we're seeing now is not just that poverty is increasing because the aging population is increasing, but actually that we've now seen a concerning reversal in that trend. We've now seen that the poverty rate has actually ticked back up after years of declines, rising in total about 0.5 percentage point over the past decade. But all of that increase has really been since 2020. So, we're at a point now where we've been actually going the right direction, as much as we'd always seen that the poverty rates for older New Yorkers were much higher than for the population overall and for the under 65 population. But now, concerningly, we've reversed, years of progress in the span of really just 3 years. And so the need is now significantly greater than it was then. Yes, the population is booming, but the population in poverty is actually even outpacing the growth of the older adult population overall.
That's very interesting. And I'm assuming when older adults are living in poverty, they rely on heavily on public benefits like Medicaid for services, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Of course, that's a challenge in New York, especially in New York City, where the cost of living is just so far exceeds what those benefits can provide. So, the correlation between poverty here in New York in particular, I think, is really driven in part by the fact that those benefits haven't kept pace with inflation. They certainly haven't kept pace with the cost of living in New York City. If you're getting, if you're drawing down Social Security in New York City, that's not even covering, a studio apartment in the lowest in the neighborhoods in New York City with the lowest median rents. So you're dealing with kind of the double effects of high cost of living, increasing inflation, benefits that haven't kept pace with those growing needs, and now an increase in poverty on top.
And let me add, if I may, that I think one of the factors here is also something that's just we ought to pay attention to, because it's not just that the population in New York is aging. It's a more diverse older adult population than ever before. And that has some impact on the poverty numbers that we're mentioning. So, it's kind of staggering, but in New York City, out of that 1.4 million New Yorkers that are age 65 and older, 51.4% of them are foreign born. So that is a huge and growing share of the older adult population. It's never been as high. And, I mention that only because, first of all, we need to plan for this really increasingly diverse older population. It means making sure that we're not just supporting nonprofits that support older adults, but we're supporting, culturally diverse older adult services, that we're supporting communities and organizations that are able to support these kind of new older immigrants that are growing and growing so fast. But it does have an impact on poverty in a number of ways. One reason is that many of them are not drawing down full Social Security benefits, and so that is one of the biggest determinants of poverty among older adults that I think we have to really wrestle with and make sure that there are other sources of income. It's why when we've been doing this research, we also focus on the ability for older adults to work and earn income, because they're dealing with things like the Social Security challenges that I mentioned. And, that kind of gets to like ageism in the workplace. It gets to the need to potentially upskill or retrain workers or help them start businesses in their older years. There's a lot of things at play here.
Yeah, I mean, I would just give a shout out to Lorraine Cortez in the city of New York. She's been championing a program to re-enter some of the retired workers in the city, municipal workers that are, to give them a chance to come back and mentor younger workers and be part of the workforce again. I think it's a wonderful program, and I think the state should look at what we did in the city and try to adopt some of those efforts, because it sends a strong signal to the private markets as well that there is a booming and qualified workforce that are willing to continue to work, and I think we should take a look at that as well. The growing share, the fact that the majority of the booming population of older adults are people of color and immigrants is tremendously, I think, challenging for the city and state governments to keep up. And you mentioned that there are nonprofits that are trying to service them, and that's kind of like the best solution that we're left with. The more diverse, the more urban we go, as a government, we just become so conditioned and accustomed to give out those contracts to neighborhood nonprofits and call it a day, and walk away from that scene. And yes, those nonprofits provide tremendous outcomes in challenging neighborhoods, but as a government, I think that's not good enough. Like, we need to figure out how to provide integrated, continuous care beyond just the nonprofit contracts that we've been handing out for years, if we want to fully service this population. But we're not even keeping up with the needs on the ground in terms of public benefits and reimbursements. So we're a few steps behind before we can have the administrative capacity to properly get ahead of this problem.
I'm going to let Eli chime in, but I just want to say really quick that you're absolutely right. I think the city council has taken some really positive steps towards making sure that some of those contracts go to a more diverse, or kind of a group of nonprofits that better reflects the diversity of the city. But there's a long way to go. But I was going to say that we also need greater investment in older adult services to begin with. The pie is too small right now. I mentioned those numbers. 36% growth in older adults just in the last decade. It grew a lot in the previous decade. The rest of the population is going down. This is where we should be increasing funds to keep pace with this population. And we have not been doing that. DFTA, the Department for the Aging in New York City, may be doing some really good things, and you gave really deserved credit to the commissioner, but they're doing it with a really tiny budget. And if they're going to do the kind of things to make sure all of those organizations, the ones that really accurately reflect the diversity of the city, have the contracts, have the ability to support their constituents, we're going to have to increase the pie in a big way just to keep pace with this growth of the population. And we have not done so just yet.
Yeah. So I want to go back to that toward the end. But before we get there, Eli, I'd love to just kind of dive into the poverty data a little bit. Does it, and you kind of touched on this, but are there any correlations with the overall trend of inequality and that we've seen in the larger demographics? Is this like the back end result of extreme wealth inequality, or is it a combination of that and other factors that post 2020 we're seeing a higher level of poverty among older adults?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think unfortunately the answer is we are seeing, inequities in our economy now manifesting as our population ages. So, the stark disparities that we see in wages and wealth by race and ethnicity in New York, well, we see those now cropping up in the poverty rates, the disparities in poverty rates by race. And just to kind of put that into context, statewide, about a little under 9% of white older adults are living in poverty. Obviously, that is an unacceptably high number, but the poverty rate is double that for Black older adults in New York State. For Asian older adults, even higher than that. For Hispanic older adults, it's nearly triple the poverty rate of white older adults. So we do see that this isn't only, it's an aging issue, it's absolutely an equity issue, and those poverty numbers, bear that out. I'd also just add that I think there hasn't been enough of an understanding at the state level that the diversity of our aging population isn't by any means just a New York City phenomenon. In fact, we're seeing even greater increases in the older adult population that is Black, that is Hispanic, that is Asian, upstate in many cases than in New York City. But that's not a story I think that's widely known. So we've also seen that, of course, that's correlated to the increases we're seeing in poverty, how those disparities play out as population ages. And it's not like folks are just coming here age 65. These are folks that have either were born here or came here, decades ago, who are now entering their 60s and 70s. But we've seen incredible growth. I mean, for instance, the Asian population in Buffalo, in Buffalo is, more than double the older adult population that's Asian in Buffalo. We've seen the number of Hispanic older adults outpacing the older white population, not just in New York City, which is the case, but in Albany, in Dutchess County, in Erie County, in Nassau County, in Saratoga, in Rensselaer, all over the state. So we are seeing, an incredible growth in the diversity of the state's aging population statewide, not just a 5-borough phenomenon, but coming with that are some massive inequities in terms of poverty rates that obviously predated folks turning 65, but are coming with us, coming with them as they age.
Yeah, I mean, so it's one thing to review all the numbers and data, but it's another thing to actually see what's happening in real life stories on the ground with older adults. And just today, we had a meeting with social daycare center operators, and there's been a negative phenomenon that's been happening, in immigrant communities for years, where older adults are finding a way to hack, lack of a better word, the system by trading in their benefits at local pharmacies, at daycare centers, at home care centers, and so they're predatory also agencies that are not offering proper services and just handing out cash as they come in to sign in their monthly attendance. So I bring this up because the part of the problem that I've tried to talk about is that there's, the poverty is real and people are desperate for expendable money, and they're figuring out however they can to get us a couple of bucks so they can go buy, dinner or pay for their share of the rent, because housing is also a tremendous difficulty for older adults. And it's quite depressing after 10 years seeing this trend escalate in communities like mine, because we know what the problem is. And as immigrants, especially like Asian Americans, the district that I represent, we tend to come from very family-oriented communities where, we want to take care of older adults. We respect, older people, but more and more we see young professionals losing hope and giving up and just trying to put their loved ones, in facilities and not pay attention to it, because it's hard. It is hard to maintain a family in this tough economy while taking care of your kids and older adults. And many professionals either have to give up their careers, not to be full-time caregivers or give up on caring for their parents. And that is a such a tough, I think, cost and tough thing for people to decision to make. But I bring that story up because there is an economic cost when people have to make these tough choices that no one really talks about. That every time a professional person or working class person, most likely a woman in the family, gives up their career to take care of the loved ones, there is an economic impact to the city and state because that's income and taxes that we're not collecting for our government. So I bring that point up because even though we think investing in older adults might not sound like an economic investment, but it really is because you are helping working class and middle class families take care of their family, take care of their older loved ones so they can continue to be productive in our society, in our city and state's economy. I think those are things that never really get measured or talked about. And I hope that that's something in the future as a follow-up, maybe you can also look at in terms of data collection.
Yeah, well, I'll just add really quickly that, you talked about the kind of crisis of the aging population. We definitely also have a caregiving crisis. And I think kind of speaking to what you're saying, I mean, and this is not just a New York problem, it is a national problem, maybe it's a global problem. We've in previous research called for kind of this U.S. Senate bill that proposed a $3,000 tax credit for caregivers because so many families are like you said giving up. They are kind of throwing up their hands. The costs are way too high, or the sacrifices to kind of forego dollars from their work to caregive. There's got to be some help to caregivers, and at the same time, we're seeing real challenges and shortages in the caregiving workforce that we have, and so there's so many issues that I think you got at here that we would love to explore further.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. Obviously, there was some funding in the governor's budget for unpaid family caregiving. I think that's hugely needed. Obviously, you fought for that yourself, Assemblyman, but being able to build on that willingness from the governor to invest in those kinds of supports and ideally expand them, go beyond that, is incredibly important. And not just to be able to help support families that are caring with, where there's unpaid work right now, caring for older adults, but also the older adults who are caring for children in families, so that they're, as you're alluding to, so that their children, the parents of those kids, can go to work. So on both ends, being able to offset some of the costs, the unfunded expenses that families incur when they care for older relatives, but also so that those older relatives can actually generate some income for caring for children. On both fronts, there's such a need to be able to support that otherwise almost entirely unpaid caregiving that happens in our homes all over the state right now. But I was really encouraged to see that funding in the governor's budget, and obviously we'd love to see that and more in the final budget.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier about, Jonathan, DFTA and the lack of funding for the city agency. So a lot of the DFTA and the area agencies around the counties, around the state, was created under the 1965 Older Americans Act. And it was really a model that at that time, could have worked because of the relatively low, I think, ratio of older adults. But that law has not been updated, where the funding stream is drying up. And the funding stream is kind of, heavily relied on counties and localities to pick up the tab, which is not fair for many of our local governments. But the studies have shown in recent months that for every dollar that we invest in the non-Medicaid low-income space, we save up to $8 up to a certain point in Medicaid expenditures in the back end. So it is a huge, I think, cost-effective way to invest in long-term care if we can just figure out how to invest in that space. Roughly up to 10% of people who are older adults who are currently on the waiting list for DFTA and other older non-Medicaid services end up spending down and impoverishing themselves to qualify for Medicaid. That's roughly every year around 3,000 older adults every year who spend down to get to Medicaid. Even if we can start focusing on fixing those type of problems and fully investing in the middle market to low income to middle market space, I think we can do a tremendous service to programs like DFTA that rely on home care, community care, Meals on Wheels, nurses that can visit a couple of times a week. Those are things that's extremely cost effective, and people can retire and be taken care of at home. And hopefully we can get there in the next couple of budgets.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Well, first of all, I really appreciate championing not just this issue, but those kind of innovative solutions, the kind of financial solutions that are going to be helpful to New York City, but to so many counties and cities across the state that really do badly need help. They really kind of, with the increases Eli mentioned in places like Rochester and Syracuse, Saratoga County, Chautauqua County, like this is happening. We're all in this together, and a lot of these cities and counties, just don't have the capacity right now, and so the state's got to act. I'm actually going to be speaking in about 10 days with AARP at the New York State Association of Counties. Actually, they made us the luncheon talk because I think they really are taking this issue, the aging of their local populations, very seriously. And so I know they would really kind of get a lot from the kind of proposal you're talking about. I think we got to make sure more people around the state hear what you're proposing and kind of get behind those kind of solutions. But that's exactly what we should be doing.
Assemblyman, just to underscore I was just going to say, to underscore your previous point, we do know that there are thousands that are still stuck on waiting lists for home care right now. So, I mean, just to kind of, make that clear how urgent that is as a need. But there's a bigger vision here about what it takes to really help New Yorkers age in place. Part of it is making sure, obviously, that, and you're talking about the kind of financial realities of this, but the cost of one New Yorker moving into assisted living or a nursing home, even despite the the health risks and other consequences, is incredibly expensive for the family, for the state. Helping New Yorkers age in place then becomes really a fiscal imperative. That's the most cost-effective way, and it's what New Yorkers want. So we've got to be doing a lot more to kind of goes beyond, thinking about, as Jonathan was saying, about this is a crisis where it's just a problem, but also there's opportunities here that are both in the best interests of older New Yorkers and their families, and in the best interest of the state fiscally. So there's a bigger vision there. A couple things that we're encouraged, but where there's so much more room to go. I mean, obviously the 800,000 new units of housing that the governor is talking about, to make sure that a serious share of those housing units are developed as affordable senior housing for LGBTQ seniors, which is a fast growing part of the population, intergenerational housing, where we could actually see older adults living together with families in affordable housing together. And going even beyond what's part of the governor's plan, looking at things that the city started to do, but that are still really small scale, like the initiative to legalize basement apartments, make them safe and bring them into the daylight. That's a real source of affordable housing that a lot of older adults end up prevailing, end up using. But if those units aren't safe and they're not regulated, then it's a huge risk. But they could be, and the pilot program that started in places like East New York is starting to bring those units back into the daylight, but needs a lot more support. Frankly, very little uptake has actually happened for legalizing those units. That's an opportunity. And then I'll say maybe one of the housing elephants in the room around accessory dwelling units, to see there's a lot of New Yorkers who would be willing and excited to build a ground floor unit back behind their house, all over the state. But to be able to say, hey, that's part of a strategy to help New Yorkers be able to age in place. Let's make sure that, there's a mechanism in place to actually legalize those units all over the state. That could be thousands of additional units of affordable housing where it's not just co-located with services, it's co-located with your family. That support system is right there. And I'll just say a little bit about the DFTA budget. But this happens, unfortunately, most years. But now, as you kind of alluded to earlier, there's the additional threat, or more than a threat, the very real prospect of a major decrease, in part because of the expiration of federal dollars. So right now in the mayor's preliminary budget, it's proposing something like an $80 million cut to DFTA's budget. Now about 36 million of that would be a reduction in city funding for DFTA. And of course, the city council is going to have a lot to say about that. But another 40 million in that reduction is a planned reduction as a result of the federal funds drying up. So overall, that's a pretty significant decrease to DFTA's budget. The federal funding issue is a real one. The city, obviously, the state benefited from those federal dollars, relief dollars, during the past 3 years. With those dollars going away, there's a major hole there to fill. And even so, DFTA's budget has only ever been less than half of 1% of the city's budget. But as our data now shows, older New Yorkers are about 1 in 6 of all New York City residents. So, we're talking about, 17% of the population and 0.4544% of the city's budget. The numbers don't add up. But in addition to being able to increase DFTA's budget, commensurate with that need, I think even the bigger vision, as I'm getting at with some of these issues around housing, is how does every agency become an agency that makes commitments focused on making New York City the best place in the world to grow older, and making New York State the best place in best state in the country to age. And that's got to be kind of a whole of government issue. It can't just be one agency tasked with this and then it's siloed out from everything else that the city's doing. So whether it's the exciting announcement today about a director for the public realm, the first ever role of that nature in New York City government. But what is that role going to do to make sure that it's that this is an age-friendly city? I mean, that could be everything from accessibility in our parks and plazas to having opportunities for things like electric 3-wheeled bikes in our transportation networks. There's so much that we could be doing as a city that goes beyond what one agency can do on its own.
Yeah, I mean, we can literally go from sidewalk to sidewalk and determine whether each block is age friendly or not, and that's the kind of, I think, dedication that we should really adopt. But we are an urban city, and we have competing interests, and every time you do something nice for older adults, there's a whole nother segment that's. I mean, I'm looking at downtown Flushing from here, and every time we try to do something to improve conditions for one segment, there's other competing interests that are complaining. But I think your point is that unless we're serious about having this fully integrated from a policy point of view at every agency, including Department of Transportation, urban planning, just to put it into consciousness that there are real needs for older adults. Like even having the smallest improvements around just making sure that we have enough sidewalks for accessibility, to proper lighting in our blocks. Like, those things can be, and also parking for accessorized transportation around older adult facilities. We don't have enough of that. And there's a lot of things I think we can improve on at the municipal level. But going back to your point about funding, I think we have identified some pot of money that we put aside last year when we had a surplus, and we're hoping in this budget that we can fully fund the State Office for Aging, which can then also give more funding to DFTA. But if we can't reach that point, I think there has to be a creative way to treat long-term care as if it is really infrastructure, and treat it like MTA, or treat it like when we build tunnels and bridges, and figure out creative ways to activate our state public benefit corporations and authorities to partner with us, and perhaps even create a new authority, as California has in each county, called the long-term care authorities, to set the foundation of bringing in the experts and figuring out how to leverage future income and future fees to build the infrastructure around long-term care. But I think between you, Eli, Jonathan, and others, we have plenty of smart policymakers who can make that happen. And going back to our original point, and that's what makes me exciting that about the space, that there's a tremendous problem, but we have passionate, intelligent people who have the bandwidth and the capacity to correct this course. So with that, thank you so much, Jonathan, Eli. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off for tonight?
I'll just say one thing. I think you mentioned the need for funding and creative ideas, and this doesn't get exactly at what you were talking about, but one of the things that we've called for is a statewide and a citywide campaign to make sure that the older adults we have receive the benefits for which they're eligible for. and we're leaving so many dollars, including a lot of federal dollars, on the table because just our older adults aren't taking advantage of all the benefits that are there. They may not know about it, or they may not know how to get the applications in. But for instance, we found that fewer than half of older adults in New York City that are eligible for SNAP are receiving those nutrition benefits. And just 37% of the older adults eligible for SCREE, the Senior Citizens Rent Increase Exemption, are enrolled in those programs. So that's just a couple of examples, but we could be doing more to make sure that more of that dollars that's already out there are in the hands of our older adults. So that's one more thing we could be doing.
Let me just add one last thought on the optimistic side. We really do see our older New Yorkers as an incredible resource. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Assemblyman, in terms of mentorship, in terms of the roles that they play in strengthening communities, especially after the past 3.5 years, where New Yorkers' sense of community and the social fabric is really frayed, and older New Yorkers are such a part of, I think, stitching it back together. But there's another kind of practical economic aspect here, which is that older adults in New York have been engaging in entrepreneurship at really significant rates. We found that over the past decade or so, the number of self-employed New Yorkers over 60 had increased about 44%. And some of that is, out of necessity, with older New Yorkers feeling the pinch, the squeeze, and needing to work longer and finding entrepreneurship a viable option when the labor market can be so ageist, frankly. But also some of it's out of choice, realizing that, hey, I'm not ready to just stay. I don't want to be kind of economically productive at 65. I have a lot that I want to do. I have some ideas that I put on the back burner because I worked for 40 years, but now I actually want to do something for myself. And there's a real opportunity there. And I'll say, I think, Assemblyman, you actually voted for this bill, but back in 2019, we published a report right before that called Starting Later that was all about kind of seizing on the opportunity to help a lot more older New Yorkers start and grow their businesses. But the Senate and the Assembly actually passed a bill back in 2019 that would require Empire State Development to create encore entrepreneurship programs in every one of the state's 10 regions. Unfortunately, Governor Cuomo vetoed that legislation, but we'd love to see that come back. I think there's a real opportunity for the state to be able to do more to actually unlock the potential of older New Yorkers as an economic engine. And one of those opportunities is through encore entrepreneurship.
This is tremendously helpful. Eli, Jonathan, I appreciate your work so much. I look forward to the conference in 2 weeks. Jonathan, is it 10 days, you said?
Yep.
Okay.
27.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today. And if you haven't checked out the report, nycfutures.org. What's the website again?
nycfuture.org.
nycfuture.org. It's featured on the homepage. Please check it out. And there's probably a donation page link at nycfuture.org as well. They do tremendous work. Please, if you can, pledge a few dollars for them. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.